Dr. James Foster sat at his cluttered desk, the glow of his computer screen illuminating his face in the dimly lit room. His office was filled with stacks of research papers, diagrams of complex equations, and ancient tomes that spoke of forbidden mathematics. In the middle of the chaos lay the file on SCP-0333, an anomaly that had confounded the SCP Foundation for years. He flipped through the pages of the report, eyes tracing the cryptic symbols and erratic calculations. SCP-033 was not just a number, it was a mathematical anomaly that defied the very fabric of logic. Each attempt to quantify or even contain it ended in failure, or worse, madness. The file described it as a missing number, one that existed outside the realm of human comprehension. It was not a mere absence, but something that actively resisted being known. Foster had been called in after the latest incident. A team of researchers attempting to contain SCP-0333, using advanced mathematical models, had inadvertently triggered a localized spatial distortion. The room they were in had folded in on itself, leaving behind a twisted mess of angles and lines that defied geometry. One of the researchers had to be sedated, babbling incoherently about the void between the numbers. As Foster delved deeper into the file, he felt a creeping sense of dread. The further he read, the more his mind began to reject the information, as if SCP-033 was pushing back against his very understanding. It wasn't just a number, it was a concept that existed on the periphery of reality, a lurking shadow that threatened to consume anything that tried to comprehend it. Dr. Foster, a voice crackled through the intercom, snapping him back to reality. It was Agent McCall, the Foundation's liaison for this case. The containment team is ready. We need you in the observation room. Foster took a deep breath, closing the file and placing it into his briefcase. He made his way through the sterile corridors of the Foundation's research facility, each step echoing in the cold, empty hallways. The walls were lined with reinforced glass, behind which lay other anomalies, each more unsettling than the last. But none of them unnerved him as much as SCP-033. In the observation room, a group of researchers and security personnel stood behind a thick pane of bulletproof glass, staring into the containment chamber. On a large whiteboard in the center of the room was a series of complex mathematical equations, symbols, and abstract representations of SCP-033. It wasn't just the number itself that was anomalous, it was its very concept, the idea of it existing within the realm of mathematics. "Are we ready?" Foster asked, his voice betraying a hint of the unease gnawing at him. "As ready as we'll ever be," Agent McCall replied. "We've isolated the equations as much as possible. The room is sealed. All we need is your analysis." Foster nodded, taking his place at the front of the room. He picked up a marker, his hand trembling slightly. As he began to write, trying to encapsulate SCP-033 within a mathematical framework, he felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The numbers seemed to shift on the board, lines bending and twisting in ways that made his eyes hurt. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the very core of his being. The equations on the board began to pulse, the symbols writhing as if alive. The room around him seemed to warp, the edges of reality blurring. Foster felt his heart race as he struggled to maintain his focus, but the numbers were relentless, pressing into his mind like icy tendrils. "It's reacting," one of the researchers whispered, eyes wide with fear. It's trying to escape." Alarms blared as the containment room began to distort, the walls bowing outward as if under immense pressure. Foster could hear the cracking of glass, the groan of metal twisting. He dropped the marker, stumbling back as SCP-0333 pushed against its containment, a force that defied understanding, a presence that was both there and not there. "We need to abort," McCall shouted, but it was too late. The equations on the board exploded into a cacophony of numbers and symbols, swirling in a vortex of impossible geometry. Foster watched in horror as the symbols tore through the air, ripping at the fabric of reality itself. He fell to the ground, clutching his head as a high-pitched scream filled his ears. It was as if the number was speaking to him, a voice of chaos whispering secrets that no human was meant to know. Images flashed before his eyes, endless voids, fractal patterns that spiraled into infinity, a glimpse of a reality where the rules of existence were nothing more than a fragile illusion. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The room snapped back to normal, the equations on the board falling silent. The air was heavy with a lingering sense of wrongness, as if something had brushed against the edge of their world and left a scar. Foster lay on the floor, gasping for breath. Around him, the other researchers were in similar states of shock, some of them weeping openly. Agent McCall was already barking orders, calling for medical teams and containment specialists. But Foster knew, deep down, that there was no containing SCP-033. It was not something that could be confined or understood. It was a whisper in the dark, a shadow at the corner of the eye, a reminder that there were things in this universe that defied reason and logic. As he was helped to his feet, he caught a final glimpse of the board. The equations were still there, but they were different now, subtly altered in a way that made his skin crawl. It was as if SCP-033 had left a piece of itself behind, a fragment of its unknowable nature embedded within the numbers. Dr. James Foster knew then that this was only the beginning. SCP-033 was more than a missing number, it was a doorway to something far more terrifying. And he had taken the first step into the abyss. Dr. James Foster sat alone in his office, the door firmly locked. He needed isolation, a barrier between himself and the rest of the world. The events of the previous day replayed in his mind like a broken record, each cycle revealing new facets of horror. The numbers, the equations, they had been wrong in ways that defied logic, warping and twisting in on themselves. And yet, a part of him felt drawn to the mystery, as if SCP-033 had planted a seed within his mind. He opened his laptop, fingers trembling as he navigated to the Foundation's secure database. He needed to know more about SCP-033, where it had come from, how it had ended up here. The file was extensive, filled with reports from previous researchers who had encountered the anomaly. Each one told a tale of confusion, fear, and ultimately failure. The first recorded mention of SCP-033 was in the early 20th century. A mathematician in Germany had stumbled upon it while working on an advanced number theory. His notes were fragmented and frenzied, filled with scribbles and corrections. He spoke of a number that existed beyond the edges of mathematical understanding, a missing piece that refused to fit within any known system. Shortly after his discovery, he disappeared, leaving behind only a single cryptic message at watches from the void. Foster shivered as he read the words. They resonated with his own experience, the feeling that SCP-033 was not just a number but something with intent, something that observed and reacted. He continued to sift through the data, encountering similar stories, mathematicians, physicists, even ancient scholars who had glimpsed the anomaly and paid the price. One account spoke of an ancient Sumerian tablet, now lost to time, which contained a reference to a number not meant for mortals. His mind raced with possibilities. Was SCP-033 a fragment of some ancient forbidden knowledge? A remnant of a reality that existed before the current one? The deeper he delved, the more questions arose, each more disturbing than the last. The room around him seemed to grow colder, shadows creeping in from the edges of his vision. He glanced at the clock on his desk, its hands frozen at the same time they had been hours ago. Time itself felt distorted, stretched thin by the presence of SCP-033. Foster stood abruptly, feeling the need to escape the confines of his office. He needed fresh air, a break from the oppressive weight of the knowledge pressing in on him. As he opened the door, he nearly collided with Agent McCall, who was standing in the hallway. "Dr. Foster," McCall said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of urgency. "We've had another incident." Foster felt his stomach drop. What happened? It's not just what happened, but where, McCall replied. One of our secure archives experienced a containment breach. The files, documents on SCP-0333, they started changing. Foster felt the blood drain from his face. Changing? How? McCall led him through the facility, down a series of narrow corridors to a secure archive room. Inside, researchers were gathered around a terminal, speaking in hushed, frantic tones. The screen displayed digital files of SCP-033's documentation, but the text was wrong. Lines of data had been corrupted, numbers scrambled into nonsensical patterns. Some of the researchers were visibly shaken, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination. Foster stepped forward, staring at the screen. The files seemed to pulse, the characters shifting and rearranging themselves as if alive. He could see equations that he recognized from his own notes, but they had been altered, twisted into forms that defied understanding. "It's rewriting itself," he muttered, feeling a chill run down his spine. SCP-0333 is changing the data, changing our understanding of it. "It's not just the data," one of the researchers said, a young woman with dark circles under her eyes. "It's affecting our reality. We've had reports of spatial anomalies in other parts of the facility. Walls shifting, rooms appearing where there should be none." Foster felt a surge of nausea. SCP-033 was spreading, leaking into the very fabric of the Foundation. It wasn't content to be confined within numbers and equations. It wanted more. It wanted to be known, to be known, to be seen, even if that meant tearing apart the world to do so. "We need to isolate it," Foster said, his voice trembling. "Cut off all access to the files, purge the data if necessary. We can't let it continue to spread." McCall nodded, already barking orders to the personnel around them. Foster watched as they scrambled to comply, his mind reeling with the implications. SCP-033 was not just an anomaly, it was a virus, a concept that infected everything it touched. And it was growing, learning, adapting. As they worked, Foster felt a sudden pang of fear. He glanced at the whiteboard in the corner of the room, where someone had been scribbling notes about the breach. There, amidst the chaotic scrawl, was a symbol that had not been there before. It was simple, just a single curved line intersecting with a series of dots, but it radiated an aura of wrongness, an impossible geometry that made his eyes ache. He turned away, trying to focus on the task at hand, but the symbol stayed with him, burning into his mind. It was as if SCP-033 was speaking to him, leaving messages in places only he could see. "We'll get it under control," McCall said, his voice grim. "We have to." Foster nodded, but deep down he wasn't so sure. SCP-033 was beyond control, beyond understanding. It was a whisper in the dark, a shadow cast by something far more terrifying, and it was only just beginning to make itself known. The containment chamber was a fortress of reinforced steel and glass, every surface meticulously designed to isolate SCP-033 from the rest of reality. Dr. James Foster stood before the observation window, the room beyond filled with a sterile, unsettling silence. It had been 3 days since the incident in the archive, and the Foundation was growing desperate. They needed to understand SCP-033, to decipher its nature, and, if possible, find a way to neutralize its threat. Foster's orders were clear: push SCP-033 to its limits. The room had been stripped of anything non-essential, leaving only a central table on which lay a single sheet of paper, an innocuous-looking printout of the anomaly's most recent manifestation. To the untrained eye, it was just a string of numbers and symbols, but to those who knew better, it was a fragment of something far more dangerous. "Are you ready, Dr. Foster?" Agent McCall's voice crackled through the intercom. He stood beside a team of researchers, all watching intently as Foster nodded. "Ready as I'll ever be," Foster replied, though his voice betrayed the anxiety gnawing at him. He turned back to the observation window, steeling himself for what was to come. They began with basic stimuli. Simple equations were fed into the containment chamber, displayed on digital screens around the room. The idea was to gauge SCP-033 action, to see if it would interact or remain inert. At first, nothing happened. The screens flickered softly in the dim light, the numbers and symbols holding their positions. Foster waited, a bead of sweat forming on his brow. He glanced at the researchers beside him, each one tense with anticipation. It was a waiting game, a test of patience and nerves. Then, it started. The numbers on the screens began to shift, subtly at first, then with increasing speed. The symbols rearranged themselves, equations broke apart, and reformed into new configurations. Foster felt a cold wave wash over him as he watched, unable to tear his eyes away. SCP-033 was reacting, engaging with the stimuli in ways that defied logical interpretation. It was as if the anomaly was playing with the equations, twisting them into forms that no human mind could comprehend. Increase the complexity, Foster ordered, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside him. They had to push further, to understand how far SCP-033 could go. More equations flashed onto the screens, each more intricate than the last. Non-Euclidean geometry, theoretical physics, even representations of concepts that had no place in normal mathematics. The room's temperature seemed to drop further with each new display, a creeping chill that seeped into Foster's bones. As the equations grew more complex, the reactions became more violent. The screens flickered and warped, their surfaces rippling, as if they were no longer solid. The numbers twisted into spirals, fractal patterns that expanded and contracted with a disturbing, organic quality. Foster felt his pulse quicken. It was like watching a living entity unfold, a creature made of pure concept and impossibility. Suddenly, the lights in the containment chamber dimmed, a low hum filling the air. The walls began to vibrate, the entire room seeming to pulse in rhythm with the shifting numbers. Foster took an involuntary step back, his heart pounding in his chest. "What's happening?" McCall's voice broke through the intercom, sharp with urgency. "I don't know," Foster replied, his eyes locked on the containment chamber. "It's reacting to the stimuli. But this is something else." The hum grew louder, resonating through the walls and into Foster's very bones. The numbers on the screens glowed with an unnatural light, casting eerie shadows that danced across the room. Foster could feel a pressure building in his head, a growing sense of wrongness that threatened to overwhelm him. He tore his gaze away from the chamber, looking at the researchers. They were frantically typing on their consoles, trying to maintain control, but the fear in their eyes was palpable. Whatever SCP-033 was doing, it was beyond their ability to manage. "Shut it down," Foster shouted. "We need to stop this before." But it was too late. The room buckled, the walls bending inward as if under immense strain. Foster stumbled, grabbing onto the observation window for support. The air was thick with static, a crackling energy that set his teeth on edge. He glanced back into the chamber and froze. The numbers were no longer confined to the screens. They floated in the air, glowing symbols that twisted and turned in impossible ways. They spiraled outward, forming a pattern that defied logic and reason. Foster felt his vision blur, his mind recoiling from the sight. It was as if SCP-033 was rewriting reality itself, pulling the world into its own twisted framework. A scream pierced the air, a sound of pure terror that sent a chill down Foster's spine. He turned to see one of the researchers clutching his head, blood seeping from his nose and eyes. He collapsed to the floor, convulsing as the numbers swarmed around him, penetrating his mind. "Get him out of there," McCall yelled, but no one moved. They were all frozen in place, paralyzed by the horror unfolding before them. Foster felt a wave of nausea as the numbers approached the observation window, swirling and pulsating like a living entity. They pressed against the glass, spreading out in patterns that made his head throb. It was as if SCP-033 was reaching for him, trying to pull him into its unfathomable reality. "No," he whispered, taking a step back. "This can't be happening." The lights flickered, and for a moment, everything went dark. In that brief instant, Foster felt something brush against his mind, a cold, invasive presence that filled him with dread. It was a whisper, a voice made of static and chaos, speaking words that he could not understand but felt deep in his soul. Then the lights returned, and the room was still. The numbers had vanished, the containment chamber once again silent and empty. The screens were dark, the equations gone. All that remained was the echo of that voice, lingering in Foster's mind like a shadow. He stumbled back from the window, gasping for breath. Around him, the researchers were slumped over their consoles, some unconscious, others trembling with fear. Agent McCall stood rigid, his face pale and drawn. Foster felt a cold shiver run down his spine. SCP-033 was not just a number, not just an anomaly to be studied and contained. It was something far more ancient and malevolent, a force that existed beyond the boundaries of human understanding, and it had made its presence known. Dr. James Foster sat in the dim glow of his office. The door locked and the lights turned off. His hands shook as he stared at the blank page before him. He had intended to write a report, to document what had occurred during the test with SCP-033. But every time he tried to put words on paper, his mind veered into chaos. The memory of the numbers, how they had moved, spoken, still clawed at the edges of his sanity. It wasn't just the numbers themselves, it was what they had done to him. For a fleeting moment, he had felt SCP-033's touch. A cold, probing presence that seemed to whisper not in words, but in pure concepts. Ideas that twisted and deformed the very fabric of reality. It had reached out, brushing against his consciousness like a hand sliding across a darkened window. He closed his eyes, trying to shake off the feeling, but it lingered like a stain on his mind. SCP-033 wasn't just a mathematical anomaly. It was something alive, something with intent. The numbers had behaved with purpose, reacting to their experiments as if they were toying with them, exploring them as much as they were trying to understand it. There was a knock on the door, soft but insistent. Foster opened his eyes, blinking away the darkness. For a moment he thought about ignoring it, pretending he wasn't there. But the knock came again, more urgent this time. "Dr. Foster." Agent McCall's voice was muffled through the door. "We need to talk." Foster hesitated, then slowly rose to his feet. He crossed the room, each step feeling heavier than the last, and unlocked the door. McCall stepped inside, his face drawn and lined with exhaustion. "You don't look so good," Dr. McCall said, his tone lacking its usual edge. It was almost sympathetic. "I haven't been sleeping much," Foster replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "The numbers. They've been haunting me." McCall nodded, his eyes scanning the room, as if searching for something. "You're not the only one. The others, those who were in the chamber during the experiment, they've all reported similar experiences. Nightmares, hallucinations, a sense that SCP-033 is still with them." Foster felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made it all too real. SCP-033 had touched them all, leaving a part of itself behind. "What are you suggesting?" Foster asked, his voice barely above a whisper. McCall hesitated, then glanced around as if making sure they were truly alone. "I think SCP-033 is more than just a number," he said finally. "I think it's aware of us. I think it's been watching us this whole time." The words sent a shiver down Foster's spine. He had felt it too, the sensation of being observed, of something lurking just beyond the veil of reality, watching and waiting. SCP-033 had reacted to their experiments not as a static anomaly, but as an entity with a will of its own. "I need you to help me," McCall continued, his voice urgent. "We need to figure out what it wants before it can do any more damage." Foster nodded slowly, though every fiber of his being screamed at him to walk away, to leave this nightmare behind. But he couldn't. He was already in too deep, entangled in SCP-033's web. "All right," he said, his voice trembling, "but we need to be careful. It knows we're trying to understand it, and I think it finds that amusing." McCall gave a grim smile. "Then let's hope it finds us interesting enough to keep us alive." The following days were a blur of research and analysis, each moment filled with a growing sense of dread. Foster buried himself in the archives, poring over every document, every scrap of information on SCP-033. He delved into the writings of the ancient mathematicians who had encountered the anomaly before, seeking any hint of understanding, any clue to its nature. But the more he learned, the more elusive SCP-033 became. It was like chasing shadows in the dark, a fleeting presence that always stayed just out of reach. Every attempt to pin it down, to define it, ended in failure or worse, a spiraling descent into madness. And then there were the dreams. Foster had begun to dream of numbers, of endless equations that stretched into infinity. They whispered to him, calling him deeper into their embrace. In the dreams, SCP-033 was there, a presence he could not see but could feel, its cold breath on the back of his neck. It whispered secrets in a language he couldn't understand, but somehow he knew they were secrets not meant for mortal minds. One night, the dream changed. Instead of the usual formless void filled with numbers, he found himself standing in a vast, empty space. The ground beneath his feet was a perfect plane, stretching out in all directions, its surface covered in symbols and equations. SCP-033 was there, not as a number but as an entity, a shape that shifted and twisted in ways that defied comprehension. It spoke to him, not in words but in concepts, ideas that flooded his mind. It showed him glimpses of its world, a place where numbers were alive, where equations were not just abstract concepts but living, breathing entities. Foster felt himself being pulled in, drawn into a world that was both alien and terrifying. He woke with a start, his body drenched in cold sweat. The room was dark, the air thick with the scent of fear. He could still feel SCP-033's presence, lingering in the shadows, watching him. Foster knew then that he was losing himself to the anomaly. It was burrowing into his mind, planting its seeds of madness. But more than that, it was communicating with him, revealing parts of itself in a way that was both intimate and horrifying. It wanted something from him, something he couldn't yet understand. The next morning, Foster returned to the observation chamber. The room was empty now, the equipment removed, but the memory of what had happened there lingered. He approached the observation window, staring into the containment room beyond. For a moment, he thought he saw something, numbers floating in the air, shifting and writhing in patterns that made his eyes ache. But then they were gone, leaving only the cold, sterile emptiness. Foster pressed his hand against the glass, feeling a chill seep into his skin. He closed his eyes, letting the silence envelop him. He could almost hear it, the whisper of numbers, the hum of equations moving through the air.
SCP-033 was still there, lurking just beyond the edge of perception, watching him with a cold, calculating gaze. It was waiting, biding its time. And Foster knew that when it finally made its move, he would be powerless to stop it.
It was more than just a number. It was a predator, and it had chosen him as its prey. Dr. James Foster sat at his desk, staring blankly at the equations scattered before him. Numbers and symbols danced across the page, weaving themselves into patterns that defied logic. It had been days since he last slept, and the world around him was beginning to fray at the edges. The lines between reality and the nightmare that SCP-033 had drawn him into were blurring, and he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. He glanced around his office, half expecting to see the numbers floating in the air again, like spectral entities ready to close in on him. The shadows seemed to stretch and contract in his peripheral vision, twisting into shapes that made his skin crawl. He rubbed his eyes, trying to clear the fog that clouded his thoughts, but it was no use. SCP-033 had taken root in his mind, and it was slowly driving him mad. He turned his attention back to the papers on his desk, trying to focus on the task at hand. They were supposed to be a record of his research, but they had become a chaotic jumble of half-formed ideas and cryptic symbols. It was as if SCP-033 was rewriting his thoughts, twisting his understanding of mathematics into something grotesque and alien. A knock on the door snapped him out of his daze. Foster jumped, his heart racing as he turned toward the sound. For a moment he thought it was SCP-033 coming to claim him, but then he heard Agent McCall's voice. "Dr. Foster? Are you in there?" Foster hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. He opened the door just a crack, peering out into the dimly lit hallway. McCall stood there, his expression grim. "We need to talk," McCall said. "It's about the others." Foster let him in, closing the door quickly behind him, as if that could somehow keep SCP-033 at bay. McCall took a seat, his eyes fixed on Foster with a look of concern that was almost unnerving in its intensity. "What about the others?" Foster asked, though he already had a sinking feeling that he knew the answer. "They're deteriorating," McCall replied, his voice low. "The researchers who were present during the last experiment, they're experiencing severe psychological distress, hallucinations, paranoia, in some cases complete mental breakdown." Foster nodded slowly. He had expected as much. SCP-033 wasn't content with merely existing, it wanted to spread, to infect. It had reached into their minds and left its mark, a stain that could not be washed away. "And you," McCall continued, his eyes boring into Foster's. "How are you holding up?" Foster hesitated, his gaze drifting to the window. Outside, the world looked distorted, the trees and buildings bending and warping, as if viewed through a funhouse mirror. He blinked, and the image snapped back to normal, but the unease remained. "I'm coping," he said finally, though he knew it was a lie. He was far from coping. He was hanging on by a thread, and SCP-033 was slowly unraveling it. McCall watched him for a long moment, then nodded. "I've been reviewing the footage from the experiments. There's something strange about the way SCP-033 interacts with you specifically. It's almost as if it's focused on you." Foster felt a chill run down his spine. He had felt it too, that sense of being watched, of being targeted. SCP-033 had singled him out, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was because it saw something in him, something it wanted. "We need to find a way to contain it," McCall said, breaking the silence, "before it does any more damage." Foster nodded, though he had no idea how they were supposed to contain something that existed beyond the realm of understanding. SCP-033 wasn't just a number, it was an idea, a concept that had taken on a life of its own. It was like trying to trap a shadow, to hold on to something that slipped through your fingers, no matter how tightly you grasped. After McCall left, Foster sat in silence, the room around him closing in like the walls of a tomb. He felt SCP-033's presence, lurking just beyond the edge of his perception, whispering to him in a language of numbers and voids. That night, the dreams returned. He found himself standing in the endless void again, the ground beneath his feet covered in writhing equations. SCP-033 was there, a presence that he could feel but not see. It spoke to him in concepts, in flashes of insight that pierced his mind like knives. Images flooded his vision, fractured realities, worlds torn apart by the intrusion of impossible numbers. He saw himself standing at the center of a maelstrom of symbols, his eyes hollow and filled with a light that was not his own. The numbers flowed into him, twisting his form, warping his mind into something unrecognizable. He woke with a scream, the sound tearing from his throat in a raw, animalistic cry. The room around him was dark, but he could feel SCP-033's presence, a cold, malignant force that pressed against his skin like icy fingers. He stumbled out of bed, his head spinning as he tried to shake off the remnants of the dream. He glanced at the window, expecting to see the world twisted and broken, but it was still almost too still. It was as if reality itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Foster moved to his desk, his hands shaking as he fumbled for a pen. He had to write it down, to capture the nightmare before it faded, before SCP-033 could erase it from his mind. He scribbled furiously, the words spilling out in a frantic, disjointed mess. As he wrote, he felt a pressure in his head, a growing sense of wrongness that made his vision blur. He glanced up and froze. The numbers were there, hanging in the air above his desk. They twisted and writhed, forming patterns that defied comprehension. He could feel them reaching out to him, probing at his mind, searching for a way in. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You can't have me." But the numbers didn't listen. They moved closer, their forms warping and distorting as they pressed against the edges of his perception. Foster felt a sharp pain in his head, a spike of agony that drove him to his knees. He clutched his head, his vision going dark as the numbers consumed him. He could feel them inside his mind, worming their way into his thoughts, his memories. They whispered to him, telling him secrets that made his skin crawl, truths that no human should ever know. He tried to fight, to push them back, but it was like trying to hold back a flood with his bare hands. They overwhelmed him, filling every corner of his mind with their cold, alien presence. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The numbers vanished, leaving only a faint echo in the back of his mind. Foster collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, his body trembling with the aftershocks of the encounter. He lay there for a long time, staring up at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He felt hollow, empty, as if SCP-033 had taken a part of him with it when it left. Slowly, he got to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him. He stumbled to the window, looking out at the world beyond. Everything seemed normal, but he knew it was just a facade. SCP-033 was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. And he was its target. Foster turned away from the window, his mind racing. He had to do something, to find a way to stop SCP-033 before it could destroy him. But as he sat down at his desk, staring at the cryptic symbols scattered across the page, he couldn't help but wonder if it was already too late. SCP-033 had gotten inside his mind, and he feared it would never let him go. Dr. James Foster sat hunched over his desk, the overhead light casting long shadows across the room. He was surrounded by a sea of papers, each covered in scrawled equations and cryptic symbols. His eyes were bloodshot, dark circles etched beneath them from countless sleepless nights. He had been consumed by SCP-0333, driven by a desperate need to understand it, to decipher the enigma that had wormed its way into his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them, the numbers, twisting and writhing, whispering secrets that his mind could barely grasp. They called to him, luring him deeper into the abyss with promises of forbidden knowledge. He was terrified, but he couldn't stop. It was as if SCP-0333 had become a part of him, an infection that spread with every thought, every breath. His hands shook as he reached for a fresh sheet of paper. He had to focus, to channel the fear into something useful. If he could just find a pattern, a way to understand the anomaly, maybe he could find a way to stop it. He began to write, his pen moving frantically across the page. The equations spilled out, fragments of the dream that SCP-0333 had shown him, pieces of a puzzle that he couldn't quite fit together. The numbers seemed to pulse beneath his fingertips, alive with a sinister energy. As he worked, he felt a presence in the room, a cold, suffocating weight pressing down on him. He glanced up, half expecting to see SCP-033's numbers hanging in the air again. But the room was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted, an invisible gaze that pierced through him. He turned back to his work, trying to ignore the sensation. He was so close he could feel it, a breakthrough that hovered just out of reach. The numbers were starting to make sense, to form a pattern that was almost comprehensible. It was as if SCP-033 was speaking to him, guiding his hand as he wrote. Hours passed, the world outside fading into darkness. Foster was lost in the numbers, his mind a whirl of symbols and equations. He scribbled furiously, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The paper beneath his hand was covered in intricate patterns, shapes that seemed to pulse and shift in the dim light. Then, suddenly it all clicked into place. Foster froze, his pen hovering over the paper. He stared at the equations, his eyes widening in shock. He had done it. He had found the pattern, the key to understanding SCP-033. It was there, laid out before him in black and white, a series of equations that transcended the boundaries of human comprehension. But with the revelation came a deep, gnawing dread. The numbers weren't just a mathematical anomaly, they were a doorway, a passage to something far greater and far more terrifying than he had ever imagined. SCP-033 wasn't just a missing number. It was a fragment of a larger, incomprehensible truth, a glimpse into a reality that defied all logic and reason. Foster felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls warping and twisting as the numbers burned into his mind. He could feel SCP-033's presence, looming over him, pressing in on all sides. It was then that he realized the truth. SCP-033 was not just an entity, it was a harbinger, a messenger of something that lay beyond the veil of reality. It had been reaching out to him, drawing him into its web, showing him pieces of a puzzle that he was never meant to solve. And now that he had seen it, there was no turning back. Foster pushed back from the desk, his chair toppling over as he stumbled to his feet. He had to get out, had to escape the suffocating weight of SCP-0333's influence. But as he turned toward the door, he saw it, numbers, spiraling in the air, forming a latticework of impossible geometry. He froze, his breath hitching in his throat. The numbers were everywhere, filling the room with their sickening, pulsing glow. They twisted and writhed, forming shapes that made his vision blur, his mind ache. It was as if reality itself was being rewritten, bent to the will of SCP-033. "No," Foster whispered, his voice trembling. "This can't be happening." But it was happening. The numbers were alive, spreading through the air like a virus. He could feel them pressing against his skin, crawling into his mind. They whispered to him, a chorus of voices that spoke in a language of madness. He fell to his knees, clutching his head as the numbers invaded his thoughts. They showed him images, visions of a world where the laws of physics were mere suggestions, where space and time twisted into impossible knots. He saw cities made of fractals, oceans of pure chaos, and above it all, a darkness that watched and waited. SCP-033 was not alone. It was a fragment of something larger, a piece of a greater puzzle that spanned across realities. And now that he had seen it, it wanted to show him more. Foster screamed, a sound of pure, unbridled terror. He was being pulled into the numbers, drawn into a vortex of madness that threatened to consume him. He could feel his mind unraveling, his thoughts fracturing into 1,000 shards. "No, please no," he gasped, but there was no escape. The numbers were everywhere, inside him, around him. They had him in their grip, and they were not letting go. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The numbers vanished, leaving behind only the cold, empty silence of his office. Foster collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, his body trembling with the aftershocks of the encounter. He lay there for what felt like hours, staring blankly at the ceiling. He could still feel SCP-033's presence, a shadow lurking in the corners of his mind. It had shown him a glimpse of something far beyond his understanding, a fragment of a truth that defied all reason. Slowly, he got to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him. He stumbled to his desk, his gaze falling on the papers scattered across its surface. The equations were still there, but they had changed. The pattern he had found was gone, replaced by a jumbled mess of symbols and lines. It was as if SCP-0333 had taken back its secrets, leaving him with nothing but fragments and echoes. Foster sank into his chair, his mind reeling. He had been so close, but now it was gone, slipping through his fingers like sand. He had seen something that no human was ever meant to see, and it had nearly destroyed him. He knew then that he couldn't go on. SCP-0333 was beyond him, beyond anyone. It was a force of nature, a manifestation of the chaos that lay beyond the edges of reality. Trying to understand it was like trying to understand the universe itself, an impossible task that could only end in madness. Foster stared at the papers on his desk, at the symbols that twisted and warped in his vision. He felt a hollow emptiness inside, a void where his understanding had once been. SCP-033 had shown him a glimpse of the abyss, and he knew that he would never be the same. The containment facility was eerily quiet, a tense silence hanging in the air as if the building itself were holding its breath. Dr. James Foster sat in the observation room, staring at the monitors that displayed SCP-033's containment chamber. The screen showed only a blank whiteboard and an empty room, but Foster knew better. The numbers were there, hiding just out of sight, waiting. He had been avoiding this place ever since his breakdown. After his failed attempt to understand SCP-033, he had withdrawn into himself, afraid of what he might find if he continued to probe the anomaly's secrets. But now he had no choice. Something was happening, something that demanded his attention. Agent McCall stood beside him, his expression grim. "We've been noticing fluctuations in the containment field," he said, his voice low, small at first, but they're becoming more frequent. It's as if SCP-033 is pushing against the boundaries. Foster nodded, his eyes fixed on the screens. He could feel it too, the subtle tension in the air, like a storm building on the horizon. SCP-033 was restless, growing more active with each passing hour. It was as if the anomaly had become aware of its confinement and was testing its limits, searching for a way out. "Have there been any other incidents?" Foster asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. McCall hesitated, then nodded. "Some of the researchers have reported seeing things, shadows in the corners of their eyes, numbers appearing on the walls and floors. It's like SCP-033 is leaking out, infecting the facility piece by piece." Foster felt a chill run down his spine. The numbers were spreading, worming their way into reality like a virus. It was only a matter of time before SCP-033 found a way to break free entirely. "What do you suggest we do?" Foster asked, though he already knew the answer. "We have to initiate an emergency lockdown," McCall replied. "Seal off the containment chamber. Isolate SCP-033 as much as possible. If we can't contain it physically, we might be able to limit its influence." Foster nodded, though he knew it was a stopgap measure at best. SCP-033 was more than just an entity. It was a concept, an idea that couldn't be confined by physical barriers. But they had to try. If it escaped, there was no telling what it might do. They moved quickly, coordinating with the facility's security team to initiate the lockdown. Alarms blared through the hallways as blast doors sealed shut, cutting off access to the containment wing. Foster watched from the observation room as the steel door slid into place, blocking off SCP-033's chamber from the rest of the facility. But even as the doors closed, he felt a nagging sense of dread. It was too easy, too simple. SCP-033 wasn't something that could be contained by mere walls and doors. It was biding its time, waiting for the right moment to strike. Hours passed in tense silence. Foster and McCall remained in the observation room, their eyes glued to the monitors. At first, everything seemed normal. The containment chamber remained still, the whiteboard blank and unmarked. But then, slowly, the screens began to flicker. Foster leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The flickering grew more intense, the images on the screens distorting into a chaotic swirl of static. He felt a cold sweat break out on his skin as the numbers began to emerge, forming themselves out of the noise like specters rising from the grave. SCP-033 is trying to breach containment, McCall said, his voice tight with fear. Foster didn't respond. He was transfixed, his eyes locked on the monitors as the numbers twisted and writhed. They flowed across the screen, spreading like an infection, turning the display into a seething mass of symbols and equations. "We need to shut it down," McCall said, his voice urgent. "We need to." Before he could finish, the lights in the room went out, plunging them into darkness. Foster felt his heart skip a beat as the air around him grew heavy, charged with a palpable sense of wrongness. He could hear the faint hum of the facility's emergency generators kicking in, but the monitors remained dead, the room bathed in an oppressive silence. "Foster," McCall's voice was a whisper in the dark. "What's happening?" Foster didn't answer. He couldn't. He was too busy listening, straining to hear the faint whisper that filled the room, a sound like rustling paper or the murmur of a distant crowd. It grew louder, filling his ears with a cacophony of voices that spoke in a language of numbers and voids. He felt something brush against his mind, a cold, invasive presence that sent a shiver down his spine. SCP-033 was there, reaching out to him, wrapping itself around his thoughts like a serpent coiling around its prey. "Dr. Foster," McCall shouted, his voice snapping Foster back to reality. "We need to move." Foster stumbled to his feet, his vision swimming as he followed McCall out of the observation room. The hallway was bathed in the red glow of emergency lights, casting long shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, a tang of electricity that set his nerves on edge. They ran, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. Foster could feel SCP-033's presence behind them, a creeping dread that clung to his skin. The numbers were in the walls, in the air, pressing against reality like a rising tide. They reached the containment wing, the blast doors standing ominously at the end of the hall. Foster hesitated, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He could feel the numbers on the other side, pulsating with a malevolent energy that made his stomach turn. "We need to re-establish the containment field," McCall said, his voice tense. "If we can." He was cut off by a low, rumbling sound, a vibration that shook the floor beneath their feet. Foster felt a surge of panic as he turned to see the blast doors beginning to buckle, warping inward as if under immense pressure. SCP-033 is trying to force its way out, McCall said, his voice filled with disbelief. The doors groaned, the metal twisting and bending as the numbers pressed against them. Foster watched in horror as symbols began to carve themselves into the steel, glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. "We have to stop it," Foster shouted, though he had no idea how. McCall grabbed his arm, pulling him back down the hallway. "There's nothing we can do here. We need to get to the control room, see if we can." But before he could finish, the doors exploded outward, a blast of force that sent them crashing to the ground. Foster felt a wave of heat wash over him as he was thrown back, his vision filled with a blinding white light. He lay on the floor, dazed and disoriented, as the light faded. The hallway was in ruins, the blast doors torn from their hinges and flung across the corridor like discarded toys. And standing in the midst of the wreckage was SCP-033. It was no longer confined to numbers and symbols. It had taken on a form, a shape that twisted and writhed in impossible ways. It was a mass of shifting geometry, a constantly changing entity that defied all logic and reason. It moved with a fluid, almost graceful motion, flowing through the air like smoke. Foster stared at it, his mind reeling. He could feel it reaching out to him, pulling at the edges of his sanity. It was beautiful in a way that was utterly horrifying, a glimpse into a reality where the rules of existence were nothing more than suggestions. "We have to go," McCall gasped, grabbing Foster's arm and pulling him to his feet. "Now." They ran, the sound of SCP-033's pursuit filling the air behind them. It moved through the facility like a storm, warping and distorting everything in its path. The walls bent and twisted, the floor buckling beneath their feet as they fled. Foster could hear the whispers in his mind, a chorus of voices that spoke in a language he couldn't understand. They called to him, promising knowledge, power, and escape from the mundane reality he had known. But he knew the truth. There was no escape from SCP-033. It was a force of nature, a manifestation of the chaos that lay beyond the veil of reality, and it had chosen him, marked him as its own. They reached the control room, slamming the door shut behind them. McCall rushed to the control panel, his fingers flying over the keys as he tried to re-establish the containment field. But it was no use. The screens were filled with static, the system unresponsive. "It's too late," Foster said, his voice hollow. "It's already here." McCall turned to him, his eyes wide with fear. "What do we do?" Foster stared at the door, feeling SCP-033's presence just beyond. It was coming for them, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. "We run," he said finally. "We get out of here and hope it doesn't follow." McCall nodded, though they both knew it was a futile gesture. SCP-033 was not something you could escape. It was a force that transcended reality, a shadow that could not be outrun. But they had to try. They turned and fled, the control room door shuddering behind them as SCP-033 pressed against it. The facility was a maze of chaos and destruction, the numbers warping and twisting everything they touched. Foster felt the world collapsing around him, reality itself unraveling in the wake of SCP-033's escape. As they ran, he could feel it closing in, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. They spoke of infinity, of a reality where nothing was certain and everything was possible. It promised him a release from the fear, from the madness. But Foster knew better. SCP-033 was not offering salvation, it was offering oblivion. A descent into a world where the very fabric of existence was torn apart by the numbers that defied all logic and reason. They burst through the facility's exit, stumbling into the cold night air. Foster glanced back, expecting to see SCP-033 right behind them. But the entrance was empty. For a moment he dared to hope that they had escaped, that the nightmare was over. But deep down, he knew the truth. SCP-033 was free. It was out there, lurking in the shadows, watching and waiting. It had only begun to show its true power, and now that it was loose, there was no telling what it might do. As they stood there, gasping for breath in the darkness, Foster felt a chill run down his spine. The numbers had escaped their confines, and they were coming for him. And this time, there would be no running, no hiding. SCP-033 had chosen him, and it would not rest until it had claimed him as its own. The world outside the facility was dark and still, the night air cold against Dr. James Foster's skin as he and Agent McCall stumbled away from the ruined building. The only sound was their labored breathing and the distant hum of the facility's alarm systems, still blaring in a futile attempt to contain an anomaly that was beyond containment. SCP-033 was out, and the world itself felt wrong, as if reality had been subtly twisted in its wake. Foster's mind was a maelstrom of fear and confusion. He could still feel SCP-033, an intangible presence lurking at the edges of his perception, warping everything it touched. The numbers were in his head, writhing and churning, threatening to unravel his sanity with every passing second. He tried to focus on the path ahead, on putting as much distance as possible between himself and the facility, but it was like trying to flee from a shadow that clung to his very soul. McCall grabbed his arm, pulling him forward as they made their way through the forest surrounding the site. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisted and gnarled, like skeleton hands reaching out of the darkness. Foster felt the oppressive weight of SCP-033's influence pressing down on them, warping the landscape into a grotesque reflection of his own fear. "We need to keep moving," McCall urged, his voice strained but steady. "We have to get as far away as possible." Foster nodded numbly, his thoughts fragmented and scattered. He followed McCall blindly, his body moving on autopilot as his mind reeled from the enormity of what had just happened. SCP-033 had broken free, its escape shattering the thin veneer of reality like glass. And now it was out there, spreading, infecting. They stumbled upon an old maintenance shed, half hidden among the trees. McCall led the way inside, slamming the door shut behind them. The air was thick with dust and the scent of rusting metal, but it was shelter, a momentary reprieve from the nightmare that hunted them. Foster sank to the floor, his back against the wall. His heart pounded in his chest, every beat echoing in his ears like a drum. He could still feel the numbers, a gnawing presence in his mind that refused to let go. They whispered to him in the darkness, promising knowledge, understanding, power. But it was all a lie. "Are you all right?" McCall's voice was a distant sound, barely cutting through the haze that clouded Foster's mind. He shook his head slowly. "It's in my head," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can still feel it. It won't let me go." McCall crouched down in front of him, his expression grim. "You need to fight it, Doctor, whatever it is. You can't let it take control." Foster closed his eyes, a shudder running through him. How could he fight something that wasn't even real, something that existed beyond the realm of human understanding? SCP-033 was not just a number. It was a concept, a shadow cast by something far greater and more terrifying than he could comprehend. "It's not just a number," he said, his voice hollow. "It's a doorway, a passage to something else, something we were never meant to see." McCall didn't respond. There was nothing to say. They both knew that SCP-033 was beyond them, beyond anything the Foundation had ever encountered. It was a force of nature, a fundamental truth that defied all logic and reason. For a long time they sat in silence, the darkness pressing in around them. Foster could feel SCP-033's presence growing stronger, the numbers coiling and uncoiling in his mind like a nest of serpents. They whispered to him, promising release from the fear, the confusion. All he had to do was let go, to give in. "Do you hear it?" Foster asked suddenly, his voice shaking. "The numbers. Do you hear them?" McCall stared at him, his face pale. "No," he said quietly. "But I can feel it. It's like it's watching us." Foster nodded. That was exactly it. SCP-033 was there, lurking just beyond the edge of perception, observing them with a cold, calculating gaze. It was waiting for him to break, to let the numbers consume him. He couldn't let that happen. Foster took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He had to focus, to find a way to push SCP-033 back. But how could he fight something that wasn't even real, that existed only as an idea? An idea. A thought struck him, sudden and sharp. SCP-033 was a concept, a mathematical impossibility that defied the very fabric of reality, but it was still bound by the rules of thought. by the constraints of the human mind, and that was where it had made its mistake. It had chosen him. Foster closed his eyes, reaching deep within himself, to the core of his being. He focused on the numbers, on the patterns they formed, the shapes they twisted into. He could see them in his mind's eye, swirling in a chaotic dance that threatened to pull him under. But he was not just a passive observer. He was the creator, the mind that had given SCP-033 form and substance, and he could take it away. He concentrated, visualizing the numbers breaking apart, shattering into fragments that dissolved into the void. He felt SCP-033 resist, its presence growing more intense, more insistent. The whispers grew louder, filling his mind with a cacophony of noise. But he pushed back, his will a blade that cut through the chaos. He forced the numbers apart, breaking them down into their base components, reducing them to nothing more than fragments of thought. He could feel SCP-033's rage, a seething fury that lashed out at him, trying to drag him down into the darkness. But he held firm. He was in control. The numbers shattered, the fragments scattering into the void. The whispers faded, replaced by a deafening silence that filled his mind. He felt SCP-033 retreat, pulling back into the shadows, its presence growing weaker, fainter. And then it was gone. Foster opened his eyes, gasping for breath. The shed was still around him, the air cold and stale. McCall was staring at him, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. What just happened? McCall asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Foster shook his head, his thoughts still spinning. I pushed it back, he said, his voice trembling. I made it let go. McCall nodded slowly, though he didn't seem to fully understand. How could he? Foster barely understood it himself. SCP-033 was not gone, not by a long shot, but he had managed to sever its grip on his mind, to force it back into the shadows where it belonged. But for how long? They couldn't stay here. SCP-033 might have retreated, but it was still out there, lurking in the darkness. And now that it had escaped its containment, there was no telling what it might do. We need to get to the Foundation, McCall said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. We need to warn them, to figure out a way to contain this thing once and for all. Foster nodded, though he wasn't sure if such a thing was even possible. SCP-033 was not something that could be contained by walls and barriers. It was a thought, an idea that existed beyond the boundaries of reality. But they had to try. They left the shed, stepping back into the cold night air. The forest was still around them, but it no longer felt safe. Every shadow seemed to pulse with the presence of SCP-033. Every rustle of leaves a whisper of numbers in the dark. As they made their way through the trees, Foster felt a strange sense of calm. He had faced the abyss and had pulled back, refusing to let it take him. SCP-033 had shown him a glimpse of something beyond understanding, but he had survived. But he knew this was not the end. SCP-033 was still out there, a fragment of a greater, unknowable truth that lay beyond the veil of reality. It had chosen him once, and it might choose him again. But for now, he had escaped its grasp, and that was enough. As they emerged from the forest, Foster glanced back, half expecting to see the numbers following them, twisting and writhing in the air. But there was nothing, only the silent trees and the dark sky above. SCP-033 was gone, for now, but its shadow lingered, a reminder of the thin line that separated reality from the chaos that lay beyond. And Foster knew that as long as that line existed, SCP-033 would be there, watching, waiting. And when it returned, he would be ready.